Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for this conversation surrounding Robin Crookall's solo exhibition, Part Fact, Part Aspect. My name is Neil Daigle-Oriens, and I am the Visual Arts Manager at Real Artways. Before we get into it, I want to mention that this conversation will be recorded and posted onto our YouTube channel, and we will share that link after the event so you can share it with your friends. Our speakers will begin the conversation together, and towards the end of the conversation, we will open the floor to questions. If you have a question and you're joining us on Zoom, please use the Q&A function located on the bottom of your screen at any time during the talk. And if you're joining us on Facebook, feel free to post any questions on the video post. I'll be monitoring that as well. Closed captioning on Zoom is available. To turn on, click the CC icon located at the bottom of your window and choose Live Transcript. And with that out of the way, I'd like to introduce our two speakers for today's event. Robin Crookall is a Brooklyn-based artist. In 2015, she completed a solo show at Seattle's Four Culture Gallery and her postbac at the University of Montana. And in 2016, Kirkhall received her MFA from the New York University. She is currently working on a self-published book of images. Aude Jomini is a Swiss-American artist and designer pursuing collaborative and cross-disciplinary projects in art and architecture. She holds a BFA in painting from RISD and a master's in architecture from Yale School of Architecture. And with that out of the way, I'm looking forward to hearing what y'all have to say.
I'm also inserted in one of Robin's images right now. So
yeah, in case anyone is wondering what's going on. We plan this. Great execution.
Okay, so Robin, I guess we're just going to start. And I think we met, I just want to thank Real Artways because we did not meet before this. This was sort of like engineered by Real Artways. I thank Neil for being the kind of matchmaker to put us together. I think we found out we had even more similar interests than we knew about going into this. And that was a really good experience. So that's
definitely a match made in heaven.
So I think
thank you, Real Artways. Thank you.
The merging of the kind of architecture and photography and model making, these are spheres that I'm interested in. And specifically, I wanted to ask you about the kind of attention you paid to making models for your images. And I think maybe not everyone knows your work that is here today, but maybe we'll be sharing slides. I think, Neil, that's your cue for the slideshow, but the first image you can see already. I think the fact that Robin makes very careful models and photographs them is something that you may or may not get right away. And I think that making models is a delicate procedure, and there are other artists who employ this method and in photography, but not necessarily in the same way. So I think I want to ask Robin what it is about this technique. Is it about control or deception? Can you tell us more about that?
Absolutely. So I think obviously it is about control, but also deception too, and kind of my own fascination with the human brain and its ability to kind of organize and make sense of the world we live in. Like, people really want to latch on to things that are familiar, such as a room or a TV or a lamp. And my interest in deception lies in that brain's ability to fill in the gaps. So if you believe that the lamp is real, then you tend to then believe that the whole room is real, even if I maybe don't execute things perfectly. So kind of like just enough to make you feel like you're looking at a real space.
So it's sort of about getting away with just enough to draw someone in. And I think the other thing that is interesting to me is that not everyone might know is that the idea of appropriation. So this image we're looking at right now, called Lampshade, is modeled after an image by Stephen Shore, Room 28 Holiday Inn. And Neil can go to the next slide to show that. So this is a famous image, and it's part of his work in the 70s, sort of daily mundane hotel kind of taking away the kind of sublime out of the photography and making more work out of sort of more of a snapshot, deadpan aesthetic. And there's something about the texture in these images that both dates it and is really alluring. So I think that's there's something a little mysterious about the situation and what comes out of that. And I think I'm just interested in your position was towards appropriation or this particular image.
Yeah. So I definitely appropriate a lot of images in my work. And some of that is just my own way of understanding composition and understanding light, and my own way of like learning how images work and how to create a compelling image. And then so part of it's like the study of the object. And then another part of it is just being fascinated with kind of mundane spaces and objects, and how you can kind of anthropomorphize objects and how they kind of become alive in these situations. And so like this lamp, for instance, really like holds the ground and kind of like takes the place of where like maybe a human would be.
Yeah. I mean, I think that also the interesting thing about Stephen Shore is he's written about photography and principles of photography, and he talks about the mental model. So the idea of a photographer's role as having this structure mentally that makes the picture. It's about capturing space, but having this mental model that structures it, and that is what makes it a photograph or a piece of art. And so the fact that you sort of take that apart by building this image is just really interesting to me, and the kind of like time that's involved in making that. Like, for example, how long did it take you to make this model of this particular image?
It takes me about a month to make a model in general. And that, yeah, it takes about a month. So there's like a lot of time, and that analog process is something I'm really attracted to, along with actually taking film photographs of the pieces. So my background kind of started out as a craft person in ceramics before I became a photographer. And so building and spending a significant amount of time with an object is something that I've always been really like gravitated towards. I'm slowing down when looking at the image as I'm like building it very slowly. Something else you said about like the mental model. So something else interesting about a lot of my work, I will actually draw a 2D image of something I'm thinking about creating in my brain. Then I will create it as an object, and then I will photograph it to turn it back into a 2-dimensional object. And I think that like just the absurdity of that process in it of itself kind of replicate some of like the futility that I find in like ownership, environmental ownership specifically, and this idea of permanence. So kind of I want to create absurd things, and I think in order to do that, creating it in an absurd way helps me kind of capture that.
Yeah, we talked a lot about the absurdity of making something that just then gets discarded and flattened out. And also the fact that you use cheap materials, cardboard, and we were just talking before we got on about how there was a shortage of cardboard sometime in the pandemic, and how certain materials that are cheap can then become, prized. And I mean, you use a mix of recycled materials and sheets. So there's a blurring of a lot of things. There's a sort of blurring of what is craft, right? And this indeterminate space of what is crafted and what is artwork and what is ownership for you. And you sort of like to stand on that border, which I really gravitated towards, or at least that's what I'm reading into a lot of your work.
Yeah.
That's something that I was like, this kind of mystery that comes out of that, like not knowing kind of where to fit into it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely interested in having like mystery in my work, and it's not necessarily like important for me that the audience like understands all the references that I'm making. And it's more important that that the image itself is believable as a real space. And so there's kind of like two things going on. So hopefully I find satisfaction if my viewer just thinks that the image is a real space. But then there's also some satisfaction if the viewer does, quote unquote, like get the references, then when they see these appropriated images next to my unappropriated images, they might kind of lose grasp of reality and not know like who took the photo anymore. And so I'm kind of interested in that, and that kind of circles back to ownership and like who owns an image. And like if we're talking about maybe like a appropriated piece from like Robert Adams, you know, he doesn't own the houses that he is taking photographs of. And so like who owns that? Does he own that angle, you know? So and same with Stephen Shore, you know, this isn't his room, it's not his lamp, it's not his TV, you know. So
I think there was something about travel and his work and the kind of like American freedom of moving around and transient spaces or being kind of fluid, right? And so there's something about that. And also that I really like the idea that you don't necessarily show your audience the appropriated images, you don't really know. So like it has me kind of looking them up, finding different versions on the internet, like also like, you know, seeing other versions of appropriated images, let's and kind of losing.
Neil, let's flip through a couple more of kind of the like appropriated images, just so people can see.
So Gordon Matta Clark that's an interesting one also because it brings in the idea of the cut and architecture and the fact that you're fabricating this cut that is a famous performance in a way. And sort of like what remains of that performance is to document the photo, and that's kind of what everyone remembers or knows about it. But the idea that you then refabricate this model, and you talked a little bit to me about how you made this model. I don't know if you want to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think you had asked if I actually made the house and then like split it apart, which, you know, in hindsight talking to you, I'm like, oh, I should have done that. I should have actually recreated the act, which I did not. I just created the room in it of itself, and I created the split first, and then I created the outside of the house piece afterwards. But I think talking about, especially like that this is a documentation of an action, and then me appropriating the image of a documentation, also kind of just circles back again to ownership, and that for so long before photography was fine art, it was a way to document things. And it was even a way to document other artworks, which then allowed people to then kind of own that for themselves. So kind of definitely my work is playing off the history of photography, and as it plays into just being a way to document things and being a piece of fine art.
I find it really interesting that you have this on the left, the image that represents Gordon Matta Clark on the ladder, but you take the figure out, and you also do this in Robert Adams' piece, which is next. Neil, if you kind of click through that.
Yep.
The idea that you take the figures out, and that is something that was, you know, interesting to me, and it sort of ties into like your technique or what you're interested in focusing on.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely much more interested in focusing on the objects and our ability to put emotions onto objects and spaces, and how a space can be sad or a space can be lonely, and how we anthropomorphize these things. And I think, and they become really important to us as ways of our own memory, like a space or a place will spark a memory and become really important. The less romantic answer is that people are really hard to recreate in miniature and make look believable. So the unromantic answer definitely is that straight lines are easier to fabricate than curved lines.
Well, also that you don't doctor these. I mean, it's interesting because you sort of continuously build these, and you're like making these accretions that slow down time and remaking these, but you're also not then photoshopping something in, or like Laurie Simmons did this series with doll houses where these figures kind of come in as these different things, right? But you don't want to be so literal. And I think we talked about that at one point, about how at one point there were sort of more character-like things in your works, and that this is different thing about projection into architecture, into objects, into this idea that it is more open to the viewer's own experience and nostalgia, if there's not a literal sort of character in these. But I also saw there were these kind of objects or presences as other things. It sort of comes into the texture and the care that you put into your work. These sort of presences come back in as these insidious, rebellious objects and parts of architecture. To me, at least that's what I saw in it.
Yeah, I also think if it's void of humans, then you can kind of put yourself in that place more easily.
Yep.
That it becomes then kind of a empty room, kind of becomes a blank canvas.
And I think that, I mean, the Robert Adams is also like the whole, it's almost like the house just exists only to frame this silhouette, right? And there's something very dramatic about that. And yours is much more, there's an ambiguity that you just can't tell the scale and the depth, and everything is somewhat cheap looking, but it's also cheap looking in the original, Robert Adams photo, where the materials, the kind of like, this idea of modernism as this great lifestyle, beautiful California homes. And I talk about this in my essay, but this is sort of suburban, cookie cutter, cheap materials. And whether you're looking at the original, which is a picture of a real suburban house, or yours, which is made of cardboard and has no one in it, the materials have the same feel. And it's sort of like yours almost has more space in it because it becomes this portal into this other dimension that's very hard to pin down. And I think that's really attractive in the way that I read through these works. I also am really interested in how you purposely mess with people, because not all your images are appropriations in this show, and you sort of mix them kind of on purpose. So I don't know if you want to talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, I mix them on purpose to just kind of further confuse my viewer into understanding what is a real space. Again, so I think that's like very important for this particular body of work called Real Spaces. So putting these side by side appropriations with my own, one then maybe one thinks that Robert Adams took this piece, and then you start to question, your own reality, and it's kind of my hope that by doing this, maybe people realize that like more of their own life is like an illusion than we think it is.
Yeah, I think the sort of loss of common understanding or truth, or things being not quite real, and that's something we've all felt over the past year more than ever, but it's sort of something that is present in your work. And I think that is it's also this humor that I see in your work. There's this like play, and you're kind of messing with things, and it's sort of underhanded and sly, and I like that. Especially this piece, sort of, to me, like there's something really funny, but also it's sort of like almost like a sordid scene, but it's almost like a stage set, like where these objects are having a party, like late night hangout after party. And to me, that just really was kind of generative and also joyful. And there's a lot of that in your work. And it's the cactus on the side of the house, it's a little shiny rock, it's the way that you build that thing, and it might be overlooked, or it's the shadows that are made of paper, like these things that are mundane and sort of hidden and not necessarily meant to be these actors.
Yeah,
and they are. Yeah,
I think with the subtle humor probably comes a lot from, I'm a big Andy Kaufman fan. And I think that kind of shows in some of my video pieces, where kind of this like really, really like the subtle sense of humor, or the humor comes into play not maybe the image itself, but by the fact that I'm like recreating an image of an image that already exists. And so that in itself being absurd then becomes kind of the joke of the whole thing. And also just with if anyone wants to check out my video pieces, please do, because I think that is where some of like the comedy comes into play, where something is maybe about to happen, but never actually happens. And I think you kind of talked about this a little bit more, Aude, where that's like the humor kind of coming in repetition where nothing is actually happening.
Yeah, The Secret Life of Plants was the video I was talking about, in terms of having these plants that sort of talk, and they're about to do something sorted, but nothing ever happens, and sort of like almost just a little bit of suspense, but there's something really funny about that. It's just like this kind of apprehension or suspense that kind of leads to nothing. It's like in the end they are these mundane things, but there's fun to be had with that. And I think, I don't know, to me, like, I do see the texture in your craft as something that's really a part of that. Like, that's what gives these things personality, like the texture. And I don't know, Neil, if you can go back one, or go, I mean, these are interesting to me because you're inserting, you're actually inserting your own studio, like through, it's sort of through a cut in your image. So there are parts where the model kind of falls apart and there's a rupture, or there's a, the image I'm standing in right now sort of has your own eye in the TV from the Friedlander original image. So there are these times when you kind of break you break the wall and you reveal this other kind of dimension. It's almost like a portal into another universe.
Yeah, I think the portals and the windows are kind of my way of getting to fantasy, but without going full on fantastical image. So it's like the subtle fantasy, and kind of you get like a peek into the world beyond. So like getting to like look through the spy hole without actually lifting up the whole curtain. And I think that kind of creates a sense of like intrigue and desire to see more and to see what's back there, without revealing like the whole magic trick, which then I feel like one would lose interest if I just gave it all away. So trying to create that sense of suspense, or that there's like a cracked door open and you really want to see what's on the other side, but you can't.
And we talked about the uncanny as something that is like a thread through your work. And I have my own personal, I don't know, obsession with what is the uncanny and what is it in architecture and what is it to me. But to you, I guess, I just wanted to hear a little bit about how you feel in relation to these images. And I think particularly like the image mirror and table, if you can pull that one up, Neil, and just the way that I have thought about furniture as this stand-in for the figure, and how it can be funny and creepy, and this prosthetic and this like extra leg that kind of comes from this other dimension, and these sort of extra limbs. And there's something about the uncanny that's often thought about in relation to the body, and uncanny valley, or like kind of projecting, fetishizing objects, but as kind of a bodily or figural thing. So again, it's like to go back to the idea that you take the figures out of your work, but there's this kind of characteristic, like this isn't quite right, and this thing stands for something, or it's there sort of in between things, and it's this mundane thing that's, I don't know, a little bit creepy, a little bit funny, and you don't quite know what to do with it.
Yeah, well, it should throw you kind of like off balance, and I think that's what like some of the portals and the windows and the fake mirrors kind of help aid in having something being wrong, which is really important in the sense that if I'm, something I'm always thinking about, it's like I'm creating this world, I'm building all these things, and so I have an infinite possibilities of what to do, which can be really daunting, but does kind of push me to continue to put something odd and continue to push that that boundary of the uncanny and what makes something feel off, what makes something, you know, look right and look familiar, but then also be uncomfortable. And that's all that is what the uncanny is, the familiar and the familiar becoming unfamiliar.
Yeah. And this like kind of suppressed identity or something that's not quite expressed. And I do think of it in relation to the domestic, specifically in the context of your work, because these are all about just sort of, and I talk about modernism, but I think it's just, there's this idea of kind of modernist housing and suburban living, and there's this sort of seedy aspect to like materials falling apart and like cheap materials, and this like idea of somewhat I don't know, like a forlorn or suppressed things, and sort of shadowy closets or things going on. And that's something that of course, you know, like David Lynch, or it's just Mike Kelly's work talks about this kind of suburban, I don't know, underhand, undergoing thing. And I guess in your work, I just see like a lot of humor in that. Like you're playing with that. It's not like heavy. It's not necessarily dark, but you're also using somewhat dark imagery. But it's very, I don't know, it's very it's also sort of drab, or like I called it the drab uncanny.
I was
kind of what I called it.
Which is so perfect. That might have to be the title of my book. I might have to get the rights for that from you. Certainly, I think again, like having the drab materials, and you were kind of talking about like texture earlier, and it does directly, I think, relates to the kind of absurdity in the cheap materials that we, especially here in America, use to make these like cookie cutter houses and mass produce these things that don't last. You know, and we want the marble floor and we want this beautiful wood ceiling, and we're willing to just kind of cover it up with all these faux materials so that it looks like it's this expensive, fancy thing when it's not. And that certainly is something that I'm directly talking about, like in the work, by using or by my ability to take cardboard and turn it into and make you believe that the cardboard is a tile floor or is a wood table, you know, or is a piece of cement.
And the
you know,
spaces end up feeling kind of haunted, right? Because it's like you're kind of, you figure out that they're not real, and you sort of sit with them. And if you sit with them for a while, you as a viewer are kind of haunting them, or they're these objects that aren't what they're supposed to be. The scale's off, the distortion is sort of purposeful. It's both purposeful and comes from the fact that you don't measure anything. Like I think I was sort of interested in that, the fact that you don't, you know, you don't like plan out kind of CAD drawing. You might draw up something, sketch it, but you're not measuring these things to scale. It's not like about a scale model that's perfect. It's about the view and you kind of adjusting things. So I thought that was really interesting that you don't measure. Right.
I think too, just like your eye is often better, or just like maybe your memory is actually better than the photograph, because the photograph can be manipulated and you can't really trust it. And maybe some people have experienced trying to level a picture in your house, and it's better to eyeball it than it is to put a level on it. And then because I don't measure anything, naturally things are a little off and a little shifted, and further kind of emphasize that unease. That if I measured it all out, it would be too perfect.
And I think that's true of actual spaces, and a lot of rendering, you know, the latest and greatest, best renderings in architecture actually bring in this imperfection and this distortion. There are always these distortion effects in architecture that are used specifically to create certain feel, or, you know, the feeling of the real. And there's definitely that in your work. I see that this kind of forced distortion. You kind of force the perspective in the bathroom scene, the shower scene. I don't know if Neil, you can show that one, but there's specifically this kind of like fisheye lens that you fabricate by like skewing the angle.
Yep. Yeah, that whole like sink dresser is like is made to be like larger at one end and smaller at the other, so that I could fit more of the sink into the piece, and then the wall is pushed out so you can see the mirror. And it is very reminiscent of what you're talking about, of these like online selling of home, like viewing of apartments, and how we distort this reality, and we kind of expect that it's that way because people want to see a more perfect vision maybe of what they're going to buy.
Yeah, I talked about Zillow house tours. Now they're all sort of like these 360 weird fish. Like it used to be that fisheye lens photography just to show the bathroom and make it look bigger, but now it's a whole almost, you know, this kind of weird game world where you can navigate in these remade plans and 3D spaces that just are totally not meant for humans, or I don't know what they're meant for, but you can navigate in these very distorted models that are made of, you know, pieces of images, and that sort of feel like maybe you could get a sense of it, but I don't know what that's really doing because it's not really giving you a sense. It's a different dimension altogether, and I'm really interested in that, like this whole discipline that's coming out of the need for people to see spaces remotely, to, you know, potentially buy a house from afar, to kind of project their own ideas into it, and to be able to somewhat quote unquote visit, but it's like a more like a haunting, and it's distorted, and to begin with, it's the premise is already, you already sort of know that it's this skewed thing, but you're willing to kind of play along and navigate in it. So this, like, I don't know, I mean, I think that to me that is something that I saw in your work without you using any digital, you know, photoshopping or distortion. It's more the distortion of your craft and how you're using photography spoke to that. And that's kind of really interesting. You know, the fact that I'm someone who's really interested in digital art and, you know, work digitally, but you're using pretty analog methods and you're talking about these same things. So that's kind of something really cool.
I mean, I think it's especially nice in the fully digital world that we live in, that for me, it's such a pleasure when I do get into my studio that it's completely void of the digital, that I'm handcrafting these things and I'm taking film photos with them, and that is it. I have a very clear choice of when that becomes like a digital object or not. And even because I don't ever show the objects, and I get to choose that they are going to be destroyed, and maybe no one will ever see them ever. And with everything being so permanent on the internet, I like find like power, like destruction as power, as being powerful.
As the ultimate kind of ownership, right? I mean, I think that is your personal maquette. And we talked a little bit about potentially you're experimenting with that in the future, potentially using your models in different ways and not destroying them. But as far as this series goes, you know, you told me this is sort of, they get they become photographs and they are destroyed. You know, the models no longer exist. This is the record.
They don't last, and there's something that's, and partly because of the material that they're made out of, and partly because once they get to the photograph, they've served their ultimate purpose and goal, and then they don't really need to exist anymore. And I think it also kind of keeps that mystery alive, that if these things don't exist, you know, no one will ever really know how they were made.
So yeah, there's this indeterminacy that's really a power in itself too. And I think it opens up this dimension. There's like I don't know, I called it, there's like both a expansion and a flattening, and they're both existing at the same time. And that's something that kind of struck me as this magical, uncanny, I don't know, like power, right? This kind of spectral power that I get from looking at your work. And I also saw that as like an idea of a way to make space, right? In the time that we're in and stuck kind of just always facing these 2D images and like in front of screens, and also just, I don't know, stuck in potentially small apartments in a city. So this kind of making space for current shrinking resources, that's something that I like thought about or talked about or just wanted to ask you about.
Yeah, well, I think you talked about like, has this work come about because of the pandemic and because we're isolated and stuck inside all the time? And it's not. I've been making this work for a really long time, but I feel the poignancy now more than ever. And it having this as my practice has definitely allowed me to, escape my own tiny apartment in a way and like create these worlds. And I think, in just a world with shrinking resources, I don't see myself like, I feel myself like continuing with this practice and continuing to grow it and expand it. And it staying important, as, using recycled materials and using the small space that I have to build them in, I think just becomes more and more of value.
And in terms of like your video versus your photo work, I guess I'm just interested in the relationship between the two and how you see the potentially this work evolving into video or vice versa.
Yeah, I think it's like pretty a natural movement to go from miniatures to filming them, like a natural progression. I would certainly love to do more video work. And I think I will. It's just the challenge of like inserting like the comedy, and yeah, I'm not too sure. There'll be more video work for sure in the future. We'll just have to see what it ends up being. But it's a challenge I would like to pursue, so.
And so I guess I sort of projected my own tangent onto your work, thinking about more specifically the discipline of architectural photography. And I talked about Julius Schulman and California modernism and sort of case study houses and the kind of idea of this discipline that comes out of projecting this lifestyle, right? Like the case study houses are basically and again, it's like I think that looking at your version, outside looking in, inside looking out, and then this image of Neutra's, basically photographed by Schulman, 1950s, Perkins residence. This was a kind of a small house. So this sort of like idea of this utopia, this house that was small enough to be cheap, or, this idea of a lifestyle that's kind of sold and becomes this utopian thing
Totally.
that everyone wants, this kind of idea of clean living, easy to fabricate materials, this idea that this was the future, right? And there's like now this nostalgia about that. There's the kind of broken promise of modernism, or like the cheapening of materials and how that turns into not so great housing, or sort of, yeah, this kind of like not, and again, looking at these images now, it's sort of like hard to project that same utopia onto them, just having had the hindsight. And this image, for example, is one of the most published architectural images out there. And again, I think Julius Schulman really was somebody who really staged his people, props, and this was so controlled, and even though it was supposed to project this kind of lifestyle for anyone or everyone, or this is very idealized and it's very controlled and it's very specifically lit or scouted. And there's an image I think after that shows Julius Schulman was an architectural model, and that's something, again, this just made me think of you building these things and sort of placing these props. And here he is with a Frank Lloyd Wright model, and this kind of power, right? This power and this control of, really placing and moving these props around. And there's something about, I don't know, the deception on that, but also the playfulness. And I don't know if there's something you can say about that, but it just struck me, and just looking at this as a discipline, and it's a discipline that he really honed and taught, and it's very difficult, and there's a time and the timing and a very specific way to, I don't know, position things. And I guess you're somebody who goes back and forth a lot, like your viewfinder, your model, and how do you decide, or how do you make things?
Yeah, sorry, I was a little distracted. I had a dog barking.
Let's talk with the dog.
Talk with the dog. I mean, I absolutely like love these models and this type of architecture. I think it really relates to me and like that all American dream, how like with those Julia Sherman photos, you really know exactly like where you are and at what time, like in this world. And I think I'm definitely trying to like cap on that being so familiar and people immediately like knowing the location of something based on architecture, that you know where it is. So definitely kind of like stealing from that, and stealing from like the idealized American dream, which then again, you know, kind of goes back to like materials and whether they're well crafted or not well crafted. And yeah.
And I think, but there isn't an ambiguity, right, in your images, because it's like there's been a lot of time between, when these images were made or the case study houses and now, where the kind of idea of modernism is almost this like, I don't know, just ever present, haunting thing that we're all over and wanting to throw away or throw over. And it's kind of, or, modernist architecture is specifically of that type, right? Domestic, and the California version of that. I mean, there's something nostalgic about that, and that still has power. And I think I talk about it as this weird spectral power. In my essay, I talk about the kind of like haunted feeling of these John Lautner houses in various movies, and the kind of like houses like have a different life and they accrue power like in this media. So also these houses, but also these models accrue a different kind of power in the photography, in the film, and become something other, right? So there's something about the losing the original, or the kind of thing becoming this ghost, this like spooky, somewhat evil, like an evil lair of John Lautner's houses, which actually, he wanted to be sort of a designer for the people, or for it was really kind of this idealistic thing. But then what he was best known for were, evil villainous villas in movies, and people would just want to trespass and see them. And, they were very private and hidden, and or on top of a hill. And this idea that, living with nature, there's also something about your work that there's something with the tension of natural objects like plants, right, and the kind of landscape, and this idea of architecture, and like the two kind of clashing together, and this inside and outside. And so I guess I'm just thinking about the conquest of nature, or the idea of man living in harmony with nature, but also this like domestication of it, and how that kind of comes through as these plants in your work, and they are like these weird haunted things. And I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that, because I see a lot of plants.
I think about a lot of just like our own environmental impact on the planet, in relation to futility and environmental ownership, and what it means to like own a house or own a piece of property, or like you own the land. Like, do you really like own the land beneath you? And that the total absurdity in the fact that we've torn so much of the natural world down, that now we have to put plants in our house in pots, or like thinking about the sidewalks, that we've torn everything down, and then we have to create this little space in the sidewalk for the tree. But then we tear that down as soon as that tree starts doing what a tree does and builds roots over the sidewalk, and then it becomes inconvenient again, and we take it down again. And then, we have to basically build whole parks for people to be able to go out and enjoy nature. And then that in itself is totally fabricated.
Yeah, it's the kind of remaking and making, and there's like a different kind of scale of time in your work that's like, to me, relates to the way that it refers to these older works, this nostalgia, and also this idea that you're taking things apart in a way that slows people down. And I'm interested in that kind of weird dimension, this like, I don't know, especially now, because I feel like in the past year, like everything seems accelerated, and like we're always, I don't know, it's next thing and next thing, and a lot of meetings, a lot of input in media, like proliferation, digital copies everywhere, kind of everything kind of progressing quickly. And there's something about your work that just like stops that. So I feel like that's partially I don't know, this idea of time, right? And
Mhm.
time and slower, more, and not by being grounded or still, but by sort of this other, I don't know, more alienating, like you don't know where you are, when, or what time of day it is. Like it's
And
sort of like,
yeah, I think handcrafting everything in the image really helps with that, because if that's something you come upon in the work, then you really start to have to look at every little thing and determine, how it was made and what material it was made out of. And hopefully that then in turn does slow you down, and really make you want to spend time with an image, which is almost more satisfying for me to have someone want to spend time with a single image, and maybe is like a little bit more compelling than the video work, because especially in our day and age, people want to be entertained and they want to watch videos, and that's what keeps people watching something, is if something is moving. And so to have people want to look at these images that aren't moving and are still, that's like that would mean a lot of success for me in my work. I'm doing something right.
you have a lot of control over your models. Do you ever put like found objects or pieces in it, or is everything remade?
Everything. I think everything kind of has to be made or fabricated. I don't do found. It takes the whole fun and enjoyment for me is the craft, and is the trompe l'oeil effects, and is my ability to create everything and to fabricate that texture.
Because I think, we just in our common interests of sort of humorous and hokey things, we talked about Ancient Aliens as something that we both are really interested in. So like just so like shows, there's a lot of common interest in humorous and funny schlocky things. It does have to do with the kind of like alienating or ghostly or spooky or uncanny as well. But there's something about that show that always gets me, is that it's like such a mix up of like found things, real things, stock photo, fake things, just like everything is fabricated out of like very thin, cheap media kind of artifacts, and just your whole world spun out of this like cheap material. So you did talk about, using found boxes, or like there's like a line, right? And like there's specific kind of like, you see the corrugation on this floor, like there's kind of a material matrix, like certain things are, they take you back into the kind of like real dimension. Like this is cardboard versus,
Yeah.
You're never, I don't know. I mean, I think that we also talked about Thomas DeMond as somebody who like is so interested in the archive, and like it isn't about like, there's a part of you that even though you manufacture everything, like there's a little bit of like this kind of collage back into it of like the real material, the like real thing that's out there. And I do see that as like part of the humor or the kind of tension in it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And like, it goes kind of back to like memory and believability, and like challenging one's own belief of what they think is real, hence, my interest in Ancient Aliens. Yeah. you know I can't
So
tell you didn't get abducted. I don't know. If you believe it, if you believe it, it is real. So and
yeah,
that's
memory, I mean,
kind of,
it's something I've been thinking about. I don't, there was a recent article about Elizabeth Loftus, this psychologist who defended Jeff Epstein and some other people, because she argues that memory is this completely malleable thing that gets remade by circumstance, that it gets reinforced by others. And, that like your relatives retelling some story that maybe they skews then your memory, and then you remember this other thing and you don't remember how you even figured that out. So there's this like loss of the real and what's fact. And that's something that I think, I don't know, we both talked about, but I don't know specifically which pieces sort of speak to that in the series more than others for you.
I mean, I think they all do. I don't know if I could pinpoint one more than the other, but the general idea of how something can be real and not real at the same time is of great interest. So I like the fact that on one hand, these are all real, and they are all real spaces because I made them and they now exist in the world. And on the other hand, they're not real. because they're not, which is just a loop that I really like.
For the spaces
not
that
to
you made
interrupt.
up, go
You
ahead.
can interrupt, Neil.
Yeah, I actually have a question about that, if that's okay.
Ooh, question time. Let's go.
Yeah, so you're talking about real and not real, and I think this image and where are we? Oh no, come back. I think this image are really good examples where you've got real shadows and you've got fake shadows.
Ah, yeah.
And I'm really curious about that, about when you decide to use actual light versus when you decide to create the illusion of light through cardboard and the illusion of reflection through more cardboard. I'm really interested in kind of hearing a little bit more about like when you decide to make a fake shadow versus when you decide to create a real one.
I guess it's just more control. This is an image that actually is partly a copy, actually appropriated image of a painting of someone who copied a David Hockney painting. Oh, so really meta. And so for this piece, I needed the very specific lighting because that what was in, because I was trying to replicate this painting, and there was no way that I could get that lighting naturally. It had to be fabricated in order to actually fabricate the image that I was trying to get. So I think anywhere it's something this is a more recent image, so it's something that I'm kind of like just playing with, like where can these fake shadows enhance the piece. And for this particular image, I was going to do the whole thing in fake shadows. And then there was just something kind of like to get that like dappled sunlight. Actually, I was just like, I just need to do the real thing, the real deal. But I think I'll probably keep playing with fake shadows in order to, enhance the mystery, and also kind of confuse my viewer as to like where the light is coming from. How can it be coming from here and here and only create one shadow at the same time? So kind of another way of enhancing the fantasy.
Yeah, and I think these techniques are also used in architectural photography. There's just so much like lighting, even in daylight photos. I think distortion in general, is used, and there's just tricks. And I think the mixing is great, and it's very effective. Like I find it nice when I get lost in like what is real or not, or does it, I don't know, it makes you stop, right? And that's the thing. It's like I get kind of like lost on the border of this space that's so, I'm sitting on the front porch and it feels so familiar, and at the same time it's just completely lost in this like media craft copy. I don't even know like how thin this is, the grain on the wood, like the detail of what is totally flat and feels like paper and what is actually like a material, or like I don't know if that wood like is that like actual wood, or did you like inscribe cardboard, or I don't even know how you made that.
It's all cardboard.
It's all cardboard.
It's all cardboard. Cardboard shims mostly. Kind of this thinner cardboard pressed material that can easily be inlaid into, so carved into, and then peeled back to reveal like a lighter layer behind.
I mean, it's especially interesting to me in the way that architectural materials are now made of paper pulp or glue, and Trex and things that are like, okay, it's meant to look like wood, but it's not. It's fake, or metal that looks like wood. So there's the trickery is already present in the real world, and then to, remake it in this smaller way, like you're still talking about these things.
Yeah.
And it's very it makes it feel more real in this way. It's just like speaking the same language but at a different scale, and it was different craft techniques.
Yeah.
So it just gives it a totally different life. That's something that I was attracted to. And I don't know, maybe we can turn it over to questions, more questions from the audience.
Yeah. What do we got, Neil?
Aude, could you actually open a question for me? It's
Open a
hard for me to
question.
do
I can
it
do
while
Q&A.
yeah.
Okay. One question. Do you ever reuse whole pieces like walls from one model to another? Or do you purposely make each one its own?
I really try to purposely make each one its own. I feel like it is much more special and it kind of reflects the idea of like painting, where it is the original. This is it. This is how it was all made. I didn't cut up another piece. You know, I have reused stuff, but I find that it just doesn't really work, and it just works so much better to have a blank canvas and build up from that. I've definitely kept some things around in my life in hopes of reusing them, but it just doesn't make the same image. It doesn't work for me.
Anyone else have a question?
I guess if I answered everything, I did a good job.
We want to hear from everyone.
I am seeing a question on Facebook. Amanda asks, how long does a model take to make?
It takes about a month to make a model, and it doesn't really matter what size or scale, kind of interestingly enough. You know, if I worked on my pieces all the time and didn't have anything else that was going on in my life, it might be a shorter amount of time, but I would say about a month to craft everything.
So you're saying different scale models take the same amount of time. So can you tell us a little bit about the scale of these? Like in this show, for example, like they range from, you know, you can't tell, but
they do range, you know. It's still, you know, the work has to fit on my work table. So, but they'll range in scale. Like for this particular piece, because there wasn't a lot to it in general, it was probably like that big. But when one of the pieces, outside looking in, inside looking out, that was that was like one of my biggest models.
Can you show that one, Neil? The diptych.
You know, and that was essentially because it was kind of building two models for one image, because I had to build this inside space and then I had to build the outside space. So this one's probably actually more like, you know, 2 feet across. And I don't really know how I dig. I just it's kind of whatever I start with. I kind of lay down a flat piece of cardboard on my work table and I build up from there. And so that kind of dictates my ground floor, kind of dictates my my basement.
I think we have enough time for one more question. So Aude, if there's another Zoom question that you want to handle.
Yes, there's another question. So Gary asks, would there be an idea of juxtaposing more explicit behind the scene model photos with the primary photo? And I know that's something Thomas DeMond does sometimes.
Yeah.
And
yeah, it just really has to be the right way. I'm definitely not opposed to it. I definitely really like the idea of putting these like portals and windows that show the actual world behind. And so I think it would just be like a whole other project in the future where I just did that and I just made images that kind of showed the backs and the behind the scenes of things, which does kind of reflect back to kind of like the whole idea of like movies and sets. And I think one of the ways I would do it is I'd probably build a model within a model.
That sounds about right. I mean, it's this kind of portals within that are still confusing.
Yeah.
And it's a different way, like that's still part of your work. You're not really giving things away. And I think you're interested in, you know, to tie into the next question someone asks about why did you not include more overtly what your references were in the show at Real Artways? And I think this is something that you and I talked about in terms of just leaving it mysterious. Like maybe someone gets the reference, someone doesn't. So whether they're appropriated or not, or this idea that it might be, it's on the border of recognizable potentially, or someone gets the reference, and it's sort of something you were interested in, right?
Yep. And like I said before, it's like I don't need someone to get the reference for me to get satisfaction. Just the fact that someone would walk by the photograph and think that it's a real place somewhere is like enough for me. And then understanding the references is another level. You know, I really do that for myself and for my own way of learning about photography.
And you don't save the models.
I don't save them. I don't.
Someone else does.
I save bits and pieces, but you'll never see them.
Or you'll see them in a very controlled way.
You see them in a very, very controlled way. Yes.
And on that note, what a lovely talk. Thank you to Robin and Aude for joining us today. Robin coming to us from South Carolina. And Aude somewhere in the internet.
Somewhere in the Robin's
She's in my work. That's where Aude lives.
Somewhere in the virtual cardboard that is Robin's work.
That is our new reality.
Yes.
I actually tried to convince Robin to title show virtual cardboard, but we ended up going with part fat, part aspect. And thank you all so much for joining us for this talk. It was really lovely having this with you. If you are interested more in Robin's work, her exhibition actually closes today. So if you're in the Hartford area or Connecticut, run, don't walk. It's a real art ways. We close today around 8:39 p.m. But you can also
still make it.
You can still make it. You can still make it.
And you can also find more of her work at her website, which is robincrookall.com, correct?
Correct. Easy peasy.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much to everybody for joining us today. And we hope to see you soon, whether that is digitally or in person. Yeah. And with that in mind, have a lovely rest of your afternoon, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, Aude. Thank you, Neil.
Bye, y'all.
Bye.
Bye.